Hello, remote 8th graders. I am here to read chapter 30 of The Seventh Most Important Thing. So in the last chapter, Arthur brought Mr. Hampton to the hospital because he found him passed out in his garage. And it kind of makes him think about his own dad dying, and just really thinking about how Mr. Hampton is building heaven, and he's on his way to the emergency room to help him. So we are on chapter 30. This is page 133. It's kind of a long one, so hang in there. All right. They wheeled James Hampton through the whooshing doors of the emergency department, and a young nurse took Arthur to the waiting room. Arthur wasn't sure what happened to the cop, but he never returned after dropping him off at the door. "We'll come and get you once we have him stabilized," the nurse said kindly as she steered Arthur toward a row of empty seats. She reminded him of a pretty nurse you'd see on television. "What's your name?" "Arthur Owens." "Is the man they brought in a friend of yours?" "No," Arthur replied uncomfortably. "He's just someone I help out sometimes." He knew this sounded kind of weird, but what else could he say? The nurse pressed her lips together as if this wasn't the answer she was hoping for. She seemed unsure of what to do next. Top of 134. And Arthur wondered if maybe she hadn't been on the job very long. Do you know if he has any family we could contact?" Arthur shook his head, remembering what Mr. Hampton had told his sister, no kids, no house. "I don't think so." "Okay." The nurse patted Arthur's shoulder, making him feel even more embarrassed. "We'll see what we can find out. Don't worry. Can I get you some juice or cookies while you're waiting? We have some in the back." Arthur wanted to say yes. His throat felt like the Sahara, which is a desert, so really dry. His stomach grumbled. It seemed like hours since he'd left home that morning. Despite this, he'd heard himself answer, "No, I'm fine, thanks." He didn't know why he had to appear tough and strong in front of the nurse, but he did. "All right." The nurse smiled at him, and Arthur could tell his face was getting warmer. "Just sit tight, and I'll let you know when we have some news, okay?" Arthur watched the nurse turn and disappear through a set of doors marked staff only, as if she were his last connection to the outside world. He'd never been in a hospital by himself before. Sagging into one of the uncomfortable chairs, he gazed around the waiting room. It had a payphone, 2 small televisions showing only static, and a magazine rack with almost no magazines in it. The people in the room looked like they had been there for weeks. Some people dozed, leaning on their arms. A few read. Arthur had no idea what to do. He was miles away from his neighborhood, and no way of telling anyone where he was. He wished he had Squeak's phone number. At least Squeak would have been someone to talk to. Peppermint, an old woman with rumpled hair and a lint-covered coat, leaned toward him, holding a piece of striped candy in her hand. Arthur shook his head. No thanks. He didn't want to make friends with anybody here, or for anyone to try to make friends with him. There were no clocks in the waiting room. Arthur had no idea how much time passed before the same nurse finally came back to get him. All he knew was that his head was pounding and he felt a little dizzy when he stood up. "He's doing better now, so you can see him for a few minutes," the nurse said, as she led him down a hallway where he was the only non-medical person around. "He called you a saint for saving him." She glanced at Arthur over her shoulder. "Isn't that sweet?" Yeah, he calls a lot of people that," Arthur stammered, hoping that was all Mr. Hampton had told the nurse about him. "Well, you got him here in time. That's the main thing." She gave Arthur another one of her dazzling smiles, and he couldn't imagine how a person this nice could also stick people with needles. Top of 136. "Is he going to be okay?" Arthur asked, because it seemed like something he ought to ask, even though he didn't know Mr. Hampton that well, or at all, really. "I'll let him talk to you," the nurse answered, "and here we are." She stopped by a green curtain. Arthur couldn't help noticing how the curtain was the same shade of olive green as the uniforms they had in juvie. "Mr. Hampton, I have a visitor to see you," the nurse called out before they entered. "It's the saint you were asking about," she added, giving Arthur a wink. "Well, bring him in," a shaky voice replied. The nurse pushed the curtain aside, and Arthur took a deep breath to calm down before he stepped into the small space, trying not to be afraid, trying not to look afraid. He had no idea what to expect. Until he'd found Mr. Hampton on the floor of the garage that morning, Arthur hadn't seen him face to face since the day in the courtroom. He wasn't even sure he was allowed to be face to face with him. When Arthur came in, Mr. Hampton was propped up in a hospital bed covered in blankets. He didn't resemble the neat, brown-suited man from the courtroom or the crazy junk man either. Mostly he looked tired and old. His skin reminded Arthur of the cardboard he'd been collecting for months, but cardboard that had been left out in the rain. Rain-soaked and sagging cardboard. That was what Arthur thought at first. Mr. Hampton lifted his hand from the blanket in a small wave, and Arthur noticed it for the first time that he was no longer wearing the cast and sling on his arm. "So we meet again," the old man said with a weak smile. "Yes," Arthur nodded, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other. He tried not to look at all the tubes and wires around the man. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, hoping it wasn't an impolite question, hoping his voice wasn't too loud in the small space. Mr. Hampton wasn't deaf, he reminded himself, just sick. "Better is a relative term," the man replied with a tired sigh. "I'm better than I was an hour ago, but not as good as I used to be." Arthur wasn't sure if he should ask him what was wrong. Fortunately, a buzzer in the hallway interrupted the conversation. "You can visit for a little while longer if you'd like," the nurse told Arthur. "I need to leave for a minute, but I'll take you to the waiting room once I get back." She pointed to a red buzzer near the bed. "There's an alarm if you need anything, Mr. Hampton, okay?" Arthur was relieved that the nurse talked extra loudly to him, too. After the nurse left, Mr. Hampton motioned to Arthur. "Come here and let me shake your hand, young man." Arthur was startled. Didn't the guy remember who he was and what he'd done? "I won't bite," the old man said, waving again. Reluctantly, Arthur stepped toward the bed. For some reason, it seemed wrong to shake hands with the man he'd almost killed. He half expected a big lightning bolt to come down and zap him, or the police to barge in and arrest him on the spot. But it was just an ordinary handshake. For as tired as he looked, Mr. Hampton's grip was still pretty strong, Arthur noticed. "I want to thank you for saving me twice," Mr. Hampton said, pulling himself higher on the pillows. "Excuse me, and rearranging the blankets." "Excuse me." Arthur was confused. "Twice? The brick?" the old man said with a sharp look. "Surely you haven't forgotten that." Arthur swallowed. "No." "Well, that was the first time you saved me." "What?" Arthur thought maybe Mr. Hampton didn't remember exactly what had happened. "No, I was the one who threw the brick that hit you in the shoulder." He tried to explain. "You fell on the sidewalk and broke your arm. Then someone stopped and helped you, remember?" "Nope, that's where you're wrong, young man," Mr. Hampton replied in a determined voice. "I needed assistance with my project, and your brick falling out of the sky and breaking my arm is what brought the two of us together. That way I could keep building my masterpiece while you collected the 7 most important things for me. So it was you who saved me." Arthur shook his head slowly. The guy was nuts. "It's true," Mr. Hampton insisted. He stuck 2 fingers in the air. "Second time you saved me, this morning. I could have been lying there for days if it hadn't been for you finding me." The old man closed his eyes. "Twice, like I said." "Okay," replied Arthur, feeling a little guilty for agreeing with the guy. But he didn't know what else to do. He knew he hadn't thrown the brick to help anybody, especially not Mr. Hampton. After a minute or two of silence, the man's eyes opened again. "So, how much do you know about my work?" Not much," Arthur mumbled, wondering how much he could know about it. He'd only seen it once that morning. "Well, I'm building the throne of the 3rd heaven." "All right," Arthur nodded politely, as if building heaven was a perfectly normal thing to do. He didn't dare ask how many heavens and thrones there were altogether, or how Mr. Hampton knew he was building the 3rd one. "Have you ever met an artist who was creating heaven?" Arthur had to admit he hadn't. "That's because almost no one else has done it," Mr. Hampton said. "You can do your own research if you want to. Go to the library, look it up. Lots of people have done hell. Hell is easy to create." Arthur figured that was probably true. He could probably do a decent drawing of what hell was like, based on the past year of his life. "Heaven, that's a whole different ballgame," Mr. Hampton continued. "It takes years, a lifetime. I have a lot left to do." Top of 140. Couple more pages. Arthur couldn't help remembering how just a few hours earlier Mr. Hampton had been saying he wanted to die. He was glad the guy seemed to have changed his mind. "But now I'm stuck here." The man waved one arm in the air, looking irritated by his surroundings. There was a pause. Arthur could hear people going past in the hallway. Buzzers hummed and beeped in the distance. It was a strange place to be having a conversation about heaven and hell, he thought. Mr. Hampton's dark eyes scrutinized Arthur. So can I trust you to keep collecting things while I'm gone? I guess, Arthur replied, not sounding very sure. The same 7 things? Of course. Mr. Hampton gave Arthur an odd look. They're the building blocks of heaven. Yeah, okay, Arthur nodded, as if this made complete sense. Cardboard and coffee cans and light bulbs were the building blocks of heaven. Everyone knew that. You can leave whatever you collect inside the garage, the old man continued, but don't move anything while I'm gone. Everything has its place and is exactly where it should be. Is that clear? Arthur nodded again. Suddenly looking exhausted, Mr. Hampton sighed. Who knows when I'll get out of here? Until then, he pointed to a set of keys resting on the bedside table. There are the keys to the garage, so you can keep an eye on my masterpiece for me. He closed his eyes. Thank you for coming to visit, St. Arthur. I need to rest now. See you later. Arthur picked up the keys reluctantly. He wasn't sure whether to correct Mr. Hampton about the St. Arthur part of what he'd said or not. Wait, hold on. Eyes still closed, Mr. Hampton held up one hand in a way that reminded Arthur exactly of Officer Billy. I forgot to thank you for the very nice throne you found last week. It was perfect. Also, he continued, I asked the nurse about spare coffee cans and foil, and she said they might have some in the hospital cafeteria. So make sure you check with her before you leave. Okay, Arthur agreed as he slipped around the curtain, although there was no way he was going to ask the pretty nurse for any leftover garbage from the cafeteria. Even saints had their limits. Outside the room, the hallway was busy. The nurse spotted Arthur as he made the mistake of turning right down the hall instead of left. The waiting room is this way, she said, pointing. How did your visit with your friend go? Arthur shrugged. Fine. He's still a little confused, I think, but we'll take good care of him, don't worry. She gave Arthur another one of her movie star smiles. He could feel his ears turning beet red. Can I call someone to pick you up? You've been here a long time by yourself. Chapter 142. Arthur knew his mom wouldn't be home yet. She had made plans to spend the day visiting one of his aunts, and she wouldn't be back until late. Barbara was at a neighbor's house. He didn't have Squeak's phone number either. The only person he could think of calling for a ride home was the last person he really wanted to talk to, Officer Billy. So he's going to call Officer Billy for a ride home from the hospital. That was chapter 30. I'll post the next video soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.